This is my 1951 Matchless G80S motorcycle. Bikes like this one are often called bitses because their individual parts come from various different donor bikes. While the frame here is 1951, other parts come from model years ranging from the late 1940s through to the mid 1950s. The saddle and battery are even a present day vintage. It's on the centre stand now and in gear with its rear wheel off the ground. What you're seeing is a Smiths Chronometric Speedometer, and up until the mid 1960s most classic British motorcycles had them. But rather than start with the Speedo itself, I think it makes more sense to start with the hub-mounted gearbox that drives the Speedo cable. Because the bike's a bitzer, I've spent a lot of time making individual parts compatible with one another. Here I'm making an alloy collar to properly attach the felt grease seal to my gearbox. Here I'm making an internal spacer ring with two beefy tangs to make my gearbox properly engage with the driving slots on the right hand side of my rear hub. This tiny gearbox has a working ratio of 2:1, meaning one turn of my rear wheel gives 2 turns of my inner cable. Here's another short video of my bike, but this time without its speedo fitted. If we look down on the end of the inner cable that would normally enter my Speedo, we can see it revolves in a clockwise direction. And here's the formula for working out the turns per mile my Speedo should have to be compatible with the rest of my bike. N is the number of cable turns generated by 6 turns of my rear wheel, and simple maths says it is 12. R, on the other hand, is the distance the centre of my rear axle sits above the ground. With my 19-inch rear wheel and 4.00 by 19 modern tyre, I measure it to be 13 3/4 inches. As you can see, ideally my Speedo should have a turns per mile ratio of 1466. Sadly, nowadays, such calculations are of little use because most of these old Speedos have covered many thousands of miles and undergone at least one refurbishment during that time. So it's not uncommon for their dial faces to have been repainted using stencils bearing an irrelevant TPM, that's turns per mile, ratio, or bearing no TPM ratio at all. Here's the face of the same Speedo you saw on my bike before. Note how the 1600 figure doesn't match the 1466 figure I've calculated. Despite this discrepancy, however, its recording accuracy is still within acceptable limits, that is, within 2 or 3 miles an hour of my actual speed. How can this be? Well, the answer may possibly be found here, where I flipped over the same dial face to reveal its underside. This was probably the side that was uppermost prior to the Speedo's last refurbishment. And now I've changed the camera angle so we can better read what's on the faded face. As you can see, this formerly hidden side doesn't show any TPM ratio at all. We'll take a short break from my monotonous voice now while I ride one of my favourite routes that's just 20 minutes away from my home. Resuming the dialogue now, it's interesting to note that the Smiths Chronometric Speedo is a direct descendant of the French Jaeger instrument. As such, all its threads are metric. This can be hard to accept, bearing in mind it was made in England, and not only that, it was made back in the 1950s. Yet I can attest to the fact that this is true. The only things I've noticed to be imperial are the end of my spinning cable that enters my speedo, which happens to be 1/8 of an inch square, and the word miles written on my dial face. When servicing or repairing a speedo, it's helpful to follow certain dismantling and reassembly sequences. To dismantle, unscrew the chrome bezel and remove it, the glass, the sealing ring and whatever else may be present there. Then, gently and evenly pry off the needle while being careful not to accidentally scratch the dial face. Next, undo the face securing screws and lift off the face itself. With the bottom reset speedo shown here, the bezel, glass and sealing ring came away as a single unit, but this isn't always the case. Once you've removed the dial face, you'll have access to a previously hidden section of the trip reset mechanism. This will allow you to either withdraw the reset spindle into the case, which is an essential step with a side reset speedo before the workings can be extracted, or extend the spindle further out, which is beneficial when removing and replacing a trip reset grip knob on any type of chronometric speedo. While it may seem obvious, I'd better mention it anyway. The inner workings can never be extracted until the two securing screws at the bottom of the cases have been removed. Reassembly is simply the reverse of the dismantling process. Bottom entry reset spindles and flange chrome bezels were features of speedos that were originally fitted inside headlamp enclosures, while side entry reset spindles and standard bezels were features of standalone instruments. This side reset speedo came with my bike and is the one I'm presently running. I enjoyed getting it working so much that on the spur of the moment I purchased that bottom reset model you've been seeing just for the joy of having another one to tinker with. Here I am making a grip knob to fit my original speedo. None had been present when I'd bought the bike. And here's the knob I made to suit the bottom reset speedo I later purchased. Even though this instrument was designed to be fitted inside a headlamp, I intend running it as a standalone. Unfortunately, when positioned like this, there isn't enough clearance above my steering head top yoke to allow this new knob to be pulled down enough to engage with the drum reset gear wheel. So whenever I want to reset the trip meter on this instrument, I'm going to have to first separate it from the bike. That's no great hardship for me though, because detaching it is a simple task and I seldom if ever bother to reset trip meters anyway. Now where was I? Yes, the spinning cable coming from my rear wheel drives an input spindle within my speedometer. Here I've drawn a white arrow pointing out the worm drive that sits on top of the spindle. And here I'm removing the two screws that secure the chronometric movement. Once this movement is removed, my input spindle can be viewed more easily. The corkscrew worm drives a brass wheel that spins in a vertical plane and turns each odometer drum in short strokes via eccentrically operated and horizontally opposed ratchet mechanisms. Another brass wheel is fixed directly to the input spindle and immediately below the worm. This one rotates in a horizontal plane and moves the needle around my speedo dial by engaging with the chronometric movement I've just removed. Incidentally, the protruding end of my speedo cable mustn't be too long because that can exert a damaging upward thrust on my speedo's input spindle and hasten wear in that vicinity. This image shows the recommended protrusion for a chronometric speedo, as well as what's recommended for the magnetic type that replaced them during the 1960s. I must also be careful to avoid applying excessive amounts of grease to my inner cable. Depending on the direction in which the individual strands are spiral wound and on the rotational direction of the cable as a whole, the inner cable can act as a very efficient auger to relentlessly drag grease upwards and force it into my speedo. Some people advise leaving the last foot or more free of grease as a solution, but I've found even this may not be enough. This is what happened to me even after I'd left the last 18 inches free of grease. After receiving this lesson, my periodic cable maintenance now involves washing my inner cable with spray-on brake cleaner, drying it with an air gun, rubbing fresh grease all over it, followed by gradually reinserting it while drawing it through a clean, lint-free rag. This leaves the surface feeling greasy but yet incapable of transferring any noticeable amount of grease onto my finger should I drag a finger across it. Because of my new obsession with chronometric speedos, I've obtained a few damaged ones for some spare parts. I'm showing you this particular one because it gives us a good view of the felt ring that sits around the middle of the instrument's input's drive spindle. Apart from this felt ring, the insides of a chronometric speedo require very little in the way of lubrication. Steel rubbing against brass is almost completely self-lubricating. I soak a few drips of light sewing machine oil into that felt ring, and then much more sparingly I apply a small drip of the same oil using the end of a toothpick-sized applicator to each of the spindle oil dimples in much the same way as I'd lubricate one of my chiming clocks. Restoring chiming clocks is actually another one of my hobbies. I also like to apply a light smear of multi-purpose grease around the teeth of certain gear wheels and onto the worm drive. For this I just use ordinary multi-purpose lithium grease, but then I hasten to add that as far as this specialist field of servicing speedometers is concerned, I'm self-taught. In other words, I've had no formal training and hold no qualifications directly related to it, so you should treat everything I'm saying here accordingly. Here are photos of the chronometric movement I removed earlier. I've taken them from many different angles to try and help anyone out there who may be in a dilemma about how the individual parts should go together. The sole purpose of the chronometric movement is to rotate the needle around the dial and show me what speed I'm doing. That needle never rotates smoothly, instead it turns in a series of small jerks. The chronometric movement contains what I'll call an oscillating inertia device, similar to what's found within one of my chiming clocks. However, instead of maintaining a 1 second time interval, like a clock, it maintains a slightly shorter one. Furthermore, the energy used to drive it is derived from the entering cable rather than from a wound-up spring. With the help of this device, roughly once every 3/4 of a second, my speedometer compares the new rotational speed of my cable with the previously recorded one. If it's increased, it jerks my needle forward by the appropriate amount, and if it's decreased, it jerks my needle backwards. Interestingly, if I were to crash this bike right now into a passing rocky outcrop, my needle would remain stuck at the impact speed because it would be given no time at all to gradually jerk the needle to zero. I wonder if crash scene investigators lament the fact that modern speedos lack this feature. I bench tested my speedos on my Unimat 3 lathe, which is the same tool I use to make many of the parts I need. To do this, I made a bracket that enabled me to mount each one on the top of my Unimat milling stand. Now let's look at some of the footage to see exactly how a Smiths Chronometric Speedo works. Now here's a job I did to repair an input spindle where the thin-walled section where the cable enters had shattered. The first part of the job was to extract the damaged spindle. At first I was at a loss as to how I'd managed to machine that long square hole with so little metal surrounding it. Then, and probably because of my clock hobby, I stumbled upon the idea of mating the business end of an 1/8 of an inch square drive clock key to the remaining good end of my damaged spindle. The spindle is extremely hard and brittle, so I had to grind it to make the socket type joint I needed, and I did this by spinning a cut-off wheel in the cross slide of my Unimat. And here I am starting to reassemble that speedometer with its now refurbished input spindle. And here's how an original input spindle looks from underneath when undamaged. And here's my repaired one. Not quite the same, but good enough for me. A cardboard material is used inside a chronometric speedo to soak up surplus lubricant. If oil or grease were to get into certain places within this instrument, it would cause malfunctioning. Here I am making and installing replacements from gasket paper of appropriate thicknesses. Here I am recutting a damaged thread to make my cable easier to connect. Now I'm preparing a case and bracket for painting. Now fitting an 80mm O-ring weather seal to the glass on this speedometer. It should have been 3mm in cross section, but I had to use 2mm because the threads on this bezel are so worn they won't grip with a 3mm O-ring underneath. 2mm is barely thick enough to seal and only just manages it. Well, that's about it. I hope at least some of this has been useful to other do-it-yourselfers like myself who love tinkering with stylish, old, well-made works of art. So sorry you had to endure my voice for so long. To try to make up for this, what better way to finish than with more vocals from my bike.